During the 17th and 18th centuries, Swiss mercenaries were often hired out across Europe to fight in the seemingly endless wars of this period. During this time, a unique illness would often impact Swiss soldiers during their travels. They would become melancholic, fatigued, and often getting physically ill at times. Commanders called this the Swiss disease, and is considered a major issue to the point that soldiers suffering from this would be considered often useless in battle. The Swiss disease was later renamed nostalgia, and for centuries was seen as an ailment of the mind. Only in relatively modern times has its reputation changed from being harmful to benign, or even something to be indulged. Today in the West especially, but increasingly in other regions as well, it has become arguably the dominant factor in our culture. I for one find it nearly impossible today to avoid the constant appeals to some nostalgic feeling of someone, whether it is passive or actively done.
Are we back?
The root of this affliction, then as now, is the sense of normlessness one feels due to the alienation from one's environment, and the associated feelings of intense loss and despair from being unable to return home again, wherever home might be. Nostalgia then not only becomes something which can lead to a deep despair, but also an intensely motivating force if it is somehow possible to return to a time and place of normality. In our current society, this is where the intense marketability of nostalgia comes into play. Now, I think when I talk about nostalgia, especially criticizing the indulgence of it, people tend to become naturally defensive. After all, this is your happy memories, your blessed realm of the past under attack. When I say nostalgia kills one's soul, I'm not saying that the past is inherently bad, or that your good memories are invalidated. Everyone has some positive memories to some degree of longing for things lost. Even animals can feel this way. If we didn't, we wouldn't be alive. We'd have no way to envision ourselves in any sort of context and end up just being some sort of psychological zombie without any ability to truly relate to the world or to ourselves. The way I define nostalgia as an illness, however, would be, as I mentioned before, the indulgence or ever overindulgence of this sort of wistful memorialization. I think in Tolkien, he does the best job of describing this sort of attitude as it appears throughout his works and is overwhelmingly a negative affect of the characters who suffer from it. I would say honestly, it's probably one of the main themes of his entire kind of mythos and storyline. The entire core narrative is one of sorrowful longing combined with an inability to ever return home again. As the past moves further and further away, it becomes warped by that longing, often into something perverse and harmful. The story of the fall of the Noldor, or the latter fall of Numenor, stems from this sort of bitter longing. The more one identifies with the past exclusively, the less one is able to imagine the future. For the elves of Middle-earth, this becomes nearly impossible for them over the ages, where eventually they can only exist in some healthy state within the eternally static land of the Valinor. Men, on the other hand, while still suffering from this bitter longing, have an innately forward outlook due to the limitations of their lifespan. In this way, this bitter longing is sweetened by feelings of hope, which ultimately forms the crux of Tolkien's entire work. The world of the past, the magic, the majesty may be gone, but the undiscovered country of the future is still there.
I offer a toast. The undiscovered country. The future.
Often bitter, but sometimes sweet, I think this sort of longing is present whenever people live in times of decay. The Portuguese and their colonial descendants have saudade. The Welsh, Romano-British remnants have their hireth. Black Southerners in the US have the blues, and Bosnians have svedelinka. The British, of course, as well as their colonial settlers around the Commonwealth, have had this feeling of melancholic longing impressed upon their culture for well over a century by this point. While that bitterness is always there, the sweetness that soothes it is found in the tension between the loss of the past and the uncertainty in the future. The despair, however, comes when one relishes in the extremes and becomes trapped by them. For the general American, however, especially like a white American, I think this sort of feeling is fairly new and something that didn't really begin to take hold until relatively recently, at least within the past 20 years or so. America was spared the horrors of the 20th century wars at home, and never really had to face the collapse of the empires the Commonwealth did. As a Canadian myself, my perspective on this is a bit divorced from the American experience. As while we are obviously incredibly close to them, Canada has its own deep cultural melancholy and a nostalgic longing for a past which very few even recognize at this point. Canada as a nation is completely lost in its nostalgia, in my opinion, and frankly has no real vision, at least on the national level, for what the future could possibly look like. Canada is much like Denethor's vision of Gondor, one of eternally rearview gazing, managed retreat and decline. Eventually, in his frenzy after the final shred of hope, his son is thought lost, an almost delirious, gleeful retreat into his own tomb and his death. It's ironic that for many young Canadians, when they try to imagine a hopeful future, they think of maybe moving to the US or dying. It's suitable then that the government of Canada makes assisted suicide for the terminally despairing among us so easy. To finalize my point, there are two kinds of longing which can be labeled as nostalgic. The bittersweet sort of loss, one which is natural to mankind, yet not totally soul-devouring, but rather can be a bit uplifting. The beautiful tragedy, so to speak, that accompanies the dialectic tension between life and death. And the sour sickness of nostalgia, which leads one into despair, despondency, and self-loathing. What separates the two, in my opinion, is really the degree of alienation, both from oneself and the world, as well as from one's own soul. For myself, I've had this feeling growing for a long time now, but only recently have I actually been openly disdainful towards these frankly gross appeals to nostalgia in our culture, and how it is fed to people to their own detriment, really. Not only that, there's the manufactured nostalgia we must deal with, which is even more insidious in its predatory nature. This process of manufacturing nostalgia often involves setting up an artificial boundary line in order to generate a sort of simulacra of some past era rather than a genuine recreation of it. To give a quick example, in American culture, there's a strong sense of this sort of generational identity, which is mostly built on a sort of manufactured nostalgia, effectively locking people into certain cultural zones, which may or may not be genuinely representative of their own experiences. A baby boomer, for example, might come to identify with the free-loving spirit of the 1960s, despite perhaps coming from a fairly mundane and conservative background themselves. This manufactured nostalgia not only creates a false self-identification, but also serves to increase the sense of longing as one seeks to recreate experiences that maybe they never really had. Nostalgia in this way is a disease of the mind as well as the soul, and one, like many, which is not only allowed to fester in wider society, but really actively encouraged. This is even more intensely felt in smaller subcultures or even like fandoms, which many of you may even be part of yourselves, or at least have some experience with.
Everyone, call the resistance! Activate your sabers! Now!
These generational, spiritual, or emotional enclaves have served a useful purpose in society, as they have historically provided some degree of norms which many people otherwise lack. However, these are very easily eroded for the sake of commercialism, or else turned into ever more unreal simulacra of themselves, as whatever original community or norms which did exist are slowly dissolved over time. As I mentioned in my opening, the first diagnosis of nostalgia was coined the Swiss disease, as it was most obvious among the Swiss mercenaries. The root of this feeling was the detachment from everything they really knew, a sense of normlessness due to their life as mercenaries wandering between European wars across the continent. This loss of norms, or normlessness, is also called anomie by the French sociologist Émile Durkheim. It was identified as an affect most of all of urban society, as the old social norms were broken down by the new industrial way of life. Moreover, this normlessness is a total experience of loss, one where society is thrust into a world which is frankly unrecognizable to them, so they lack any meaningful context with which to relate to either the past or whatever kind of world they remember. In this way, Anomie provides a neat adjunct to the Marxist idea of alienation through the divorce of the products of economic production from those who produce it, and really the divorce between the act of labor and the production of some sort of profit as well. However, it is not explicitly tied to industrial or capitalist society, but can result from any sort of severe social change, as mentioned before with the Swiss, or in maybe more contemporary cases with a lot of Canadian natives in the north when they move away from, for example, the far northern territories. They often experience this deep sense of alienation and nostalgia. Alienation, on the other hand, is a more subjective experience when one feels detached from the world around them. While they both have similar causes, their scope is often different, Anomie being more of a social issue, while alienation is much more personal. While both ideas are relevant for understanding nostalgia, this sense of anomie provides the overall framework for the sort of perverse nostalgia which I feel infests modern life. Insofar as we as a society have lived in this sort of post-industrial, liberal world for at least a century or two by this point, depending on, I guess, which country you live in, this state of normlessness has presented an enduring issue. In the past, as well as in more newly industrialized societies, it was far easier to simply relate to the rustic lifestyle of one's immediate ancestors, or even to a still living family in the countryside as maybe an urban dweller. Their norms and values, their myths still held sway with people, and maybe you could even go visit them if you had grandparents or parents who lived a very rural, rustic life in the countryside. You could easily spend time with them. And this is something that many people in especially a lot of newly industrialized countries very often do. However, in today's society, for many people, this connection to that rustic past is really tenuous at best, or frankly, completely alien in arguably the majority of cases. I speak from personal experience that the life of rural folk in my country, as different as it is to that of centuries prior, is almost like that of complete foreigners to many urban people. With this detachment from whatever organic cultural stratum, what is required is something engineered, manufactured for the industrialized and post-industrial societies. In order to avoid this descent into normlessness, at least total normlessness, and the negative consequences of that, for at least a century now, in the English world in particular, there has been a trend of manufacturing a sort of popular culture for people to latch onto. This was not a sudden decision, but rather a gradual one, as society moved away further from the organic culture to the manufactured one. Culture is always self-referential. However, as we have moved on as a society, that self-reference has become increasingly recursive as culture and norms begin to reference previous references. As of now, almost the entire corpus of Western Anglo culture is merely a compilation of references to other references, forming a recursive loop always down to nothing. Our civilization has become somewhat of an Ouroboros, but no longer eating itself anymore as much as eating its own waste. I guess more like a human centipede in that case. In this context, our nostalgia takes on a form more like anomia, or rather the nostalgia for someone or something we never knew or experienced ourselves. Why are people born in the 21st century pining for the 1950s, for example, or even more bizarrely, for the 2nd century AD under the Roman Empire as one example? And I say this not as judgment, but of someone who's actually spent a lot of time sitting and thinking, like, man, what if like Alexander the Great actually did win though? Like, what if they didn't turn back? It's our deep feeling of loss combined with not really knowing what has been lost due to living in what amounts to basically this cultural scrapyard. And I think scrap is the appropriate metaphor in this circumstance because scrap still has value implicitly, whereas garbage is just garbage, it's waste. It's nothing value. So I do think there is some value in the scrapyard, but it is still a pile of shit. We feel a sense of spiritual indigestion of sorts because all we can do is consume what has been processed and recycled again and again. They feed us poison, so we take their cures while they suppress our medicine. In all aspects of cultural production, this is obvious, but nowhere more, in my opinion, than the medium of video games. Also, being as this is still ostensibly a gaming channel, I'd be remiss to not really mention them. Now, aside from the fact that, again, this is a gaming channel first and foremost, I do think that video games present the best representation for this sort of recursive culture, as they're one of the youngest mediums of that culture, and the one most dominated by the younger generations, who for the most part have very little or even no connection to any sort of organic culture. This is not explicitly a bad thing, but lacking that sort of firm foundation inevitably means that repetition and recreation becomes far easier and more tempting for any sort of creator. What results is what is at best a copy of a copy of a copy ad infinitum. And this process only gets worse as society develops and the entire process is made far easier, while simultaneously both producer and consumer are further detached from any sort of genuine experience, but rather only have sad copies to fall back on for guidance. You can imagine the degradation that occurs in this process as meaning and context are completely lost after endless copies, much like running the same image through an AI image generator dozens and dozens of times until it becomes a muddled mess of self-referential garbage. I also think gaming is relevant due to its strong communal nature. Films and music can be communal experiences as well, but I'd argue far less so than games can be and generally have been historically. A music festival or a film premiere is an experience that can possibly maybe even define a generation, or at least something that many people in that society, that cultural group, that generation looks back on together. But a game can be something which holds a community together for years, if not even decades. I think what also sets gaming apart from other popular media is how gaming has a stronger tendency towards, unintentional communities rather than something strictly controlled as the singular vision of a film. For example, if I want to join a Star Wars community, almost every Star Wars community is at its head somehow managed by Disney. You could say it's the same for games, but definitely a lot less so, and I'll get into that a little bit more later as well. Games are an interactive medium, and that very interactivity gives the consumers a great deal of personal connection to the piece than, for example, simply just passively watching a film. Another interesting feature of the gaming space is the presence of community projects, often either open source or very heavily modded games, which have grown far beyond what the original developers likely intended. This, of course, is an outgrowth of the historically kind of libertarian undercurrent of the entire internet, both left and right-leaning libertarians, I should say. Now, where does Anomie come into play? While I think this is not at all unique to games, the intense personal nature of many gaming experiences combined with their ultimate status as really simply a consumer good means they represent a ripe opportunity for the financialization of the feelings and norms which grow out of one's gaming community. What's more, we have become a society of what amounts to basically dilettantes, dabblers in everything but masters of nothing. What used to be merely the nostalgia of a particular group from a particular place and time is now in effect available for the consumption of the bulk of society. Generations or enclaves, cultural enclaves as a concept, have been totally collapsed into basically one singular generation, one monoculture that is global and timeless. And again, I don't say this out of any judgment. I'm absolutely guilty of this as well. There are plenty of fandoms or niche interests, which basically I only have a dilettante's interaction with it. Like just dabbling a little bit with this, maybe reading some lore online or browsing some forums, and that basically amounts to my entire connection with that sort of cultural group or fandom or whatever. So I'm absolutely guilty of this as well. I don't mean to judge anybody by this. In The Mechanical Bride, Folklore of the Modern Man, Marshall McLuhan, a great Canadian by the way, describes our current crisis of psycho-spiritual manipulation. Ours is the first age in which many thousands of the best trained individual minds have made it a full-time business to get inside of the collective public mind, the collective zeitgeist, to get inside in order to manipulate, exploit, control is the object now. And to generate heat, not light, is the intention. To keep everybody in the helpless state engineered by prolonged mental rutting is the effect of many ads and entertainment alike. What he describes is the stagnation or mental rutting of our society due to this gigantic entertainment, or I guess better word would be like propaganda complex, where people are inevitably trapped in these wallowing, confusing pits of nostalgia. While comforting and soothing in a way, it can only ever really lead to despair when one pines for a past which realistically they can never really return to. Keeping people in this state of sort of soothing melancholy is just a small-scale example of what goes on throughout society. even beyond popular culture and into, for example, the pharmaceutical industry. In another great essay by another great Canadian, Wyndham Lewis, I guess is he Canadian? I mean, he was born in Canada, so I'm going to claim him as a Canadian. He describes how our industrial and now, I guess, post-industrial societies, the youth are not only exploited for their labor and as a market for goods through the undermining of traditional social norms combined with appeals to them through increasingly vague nostalgia. But they in turn are more or less converted into sort of industrial robots, which serve as an ideological and cultural bludgeon in order to control the rest of culture and society through a so-called cult of the youth. What results from this is you have, again, like a mono-generation, a monoculture of eternal youth in a way. Some of you guys might see this sometimes when you see these like 30, 40, 50-year-old people really desperate to appear young or to be deeply involved with whatever the youth culture is, which is frankly a bit sad, but again, an inevitable product of this sort of process. This sort of appeal to youth combined with appeals to nostalgia, even for things which, again, many being subjected to this sort of psychic assault would have zero personal experience with, serves towards the total mechanization of society at a cultural level. In a fully mechanical society, everything ideally can be eternally bought and sold, everything predicted, everything planned, everything controlled, at least again in theory. In the realm of gaming, what could be more predictable than something that has already been done before, and possibly many times before that?
And close shut the jaws of oblivion.
To produce something new or worse, to generate a communal product with community engagement, community involvement, is really just too dangerous and too unpredictable. I'm sure many of you have seen a lot of debacles which involved either of those two things, trying something new or trying something really community focused where it just blew up. In effect, these producers become almost like cultural gravediggers of sorts. They who shape most of the past more than really any historian can, as they adjust details to suit their needs and in effect create the simulacra of experience I mentioned previously, rather than simply showing what was or what could be. Being as what we interact with and experience, especially as part of a community, can play a big role in forming our own identity. By creating these fakes or reproductions, this process is essentially hijacked for the sake of facilitating this mechanization of our society. Now, I personally am not a doomer, and I'm not here to blackpill you, as is quite popular today. I do actually think there are genuine pathways out of this that are fairly easily followed by the common man, and I really don't think the total mechanization of a society is at all possible, to be honest. Much like McLuhan, I think the best way to rise above the sort of cultural maelstrom we find ourselves in is just to sort of follow through it. One pathway specifically pertaining to culture I mentioned previously is the continued stubbornness of the open source and community-driven projects, modding subcultures, and sort of fanfiction spaces. Their very nature as long-standing collaborative endeavors gives them the air of something more akin to folklore or oral traditions of ancient times. It makes them stand out in the gaming space and gives the associated projects a kind of, I guess, respectability and long-term appeal, which few heavily commercialized products could really ever hope to match. When it comes to broader society, while I don't really want to get into it much here, my opinions are fairly similar. The collaborative and creative process generates a real lived culture of genuine experience. It recreates in the postmodern world the essence of what basically was lost from traditional society. Making a sloppy mod for your favorite game, doing a messy DIY job of your home, crudely editing images in Microsoft Paint or Photoshop, or ideally GIMP if you were a GigaChad, is much more masculine and human enterprise than just passively consuming a polished, perfect product or following the seduction of some sort of quick fix ideology which ultimately just does nothing but suck up your money. As our culture becomes more efficient and algorithmic, I think the best solution for anyone is basically to be less efficient, less mechanical, and more human. Embracing the living traditions of our time rather than this sort of warm yet bitter memories of the past. So I hope you guys enjoyed this sort of long-winded rant of mine. I won't be doing these kind of videos that often, but every so often I will put out something like this, in addition to my normal sort of gaming-focused content. Remember to like and subscribe to the channel if you want to continue supporting me. You can also become a member of this channel as well, or even just leave a donation if you want to help support me. I am going to be making more stuff in the future, and again, guys, I'll see you again in the next video.